corporate landowners, private landowners, and alike. What we're going to cover this afternoon is some schematics, some discussion around the very topic of retail to residential. Now, this is not a new topic. There's nothing new about it at all. We all know, as Alex Price suggested beforehand, that retail has come under significant pressure over the last couple of years. Certainly the rise of online retailing and so forth has really created some substantial issues in the way that our town centres and real estate has been positioned previously. Now, what we're going to look at this afternoon is three different scaled schemes. So it's a high street, it's the Debenhams and Guildford, which we've already had a bit of information on already, and a retail park in Surrey Quays. So I think before we go into each one of those, our panelist of architects here, so we have Tina Patel from Formed Architects, we have Paul Farr of C7 Architects, and Lita Kozaka of LK Studio. And each of them in turn are going to spend about 5 or 10 minutes just talking through an asset which has been sort of pre-decided, it's been out in the market, or it's been known about, or it is of a size or scale that we wish to explore. And I think I'm going to pass over to each one of the architects to do a little introduction on themselves before we move into the specifics. So if we can start with Tina, perhaps you could introduce yourself and what you'll be talking about shortly.
Hi, Alex. Thanks very much. I'm going to be talking about the Witton High Street units, and just a little bit about us. We're an architectural practice based in Chiswick in West London, and we take on residential, sometimes with mixed use, anything up to about 50 units all over the country.
Thank you. And Paul?
Yeah, Paul Farr from C7 Architects. We're based in Guildford, not far from Debenhams. We have an architectural and planning team, and most of our work is generally in retail and Resi. And generally from the Resi point of view, we go from one-off houses, anything up to about 100 units.
Thank you. And Lita?
Hi, so I'm from Studio LK, and we're an architecturally led multidisciplinary company, and we work in all the sectors, but we do have a focus on Resi and master planning. Our biggest project is 17,000 homes for a new garden community, and our smallest, I think, is about 4 units. And we are looking at a modular system. So it's a little bit of a test project. And I will be talking today about some land at Surrey Quays, which includes the big shopping centre and a couple of big retail units as well, along with some of the car parking and ancillary land that's adjacent to those buildings.
Thank you. Thanks, Lita. And I think before I pass back on to the individual architects to talk about each one of these schemes, I think it's really important to set out the world in which we're talking about here. So we've just had some really interesting insight from Rebecca on planning. And whilst we're mindful of planning, I think you've got 3 architects and an agent on this panel. None of us are going to be a planner's friend, frankly, none of us. So this forum right now is really about assuming that the planning environment that we are currently in is not going to be the same for the future. And it's recognizing that the planning policy system exists to identify where, how, and what land should be used for, not only now, but into the future. And given COVID-19 and what's happened, we really strongly believe that a lot of asset classes are not going to perform the same function that they performed previously, and that is a well-trodden discussion point over the last 8 weeks or so. So with that in mind, there are sort of 2 other aspects of creating the development or no development equation. One of those is schematics. It's architectural design, it's massing, it's quantum, it's what can we get out of this? What is the art of the possible? And the other side of the coin is, of course, viability. Do the numbers work? Do the fundamental numbers of this proposal work? And therefore, does an alternative use promote a higher value than the existing use? And therefore, does that trigger development? And obviously, behind all of that is planning. Now, planning is not something we're ignoring. It's something we know about, something we're familiar with. But if you could just bear with us for the next 40 minutes or so and just assume that the planning world has a route of manipulation and evolution, that which is not as it currently stands. And I think Lita's going to talk a little bit about how that process can be overcome for some of the bigger schemes that we're going to look at. So I think with that in mind, I'm going to hand over to Tina. And if you want to make Tina's screen a little bit bigger and focus upon her shortly, then it's the the 4 little arrows in the top corner. I'm going to go on mute for a while. Tina, the floor is yours, and I shall chime in if I have any questions.
I will just work out, I'm sharing my screen, so let me get this bit right. And hopefully that will allow me to share this. Can you all see that?
Yes, I can do.
Okay.
And also, guys, any questions throughout, just pop them in the Q&A box, please, and we'll come to them, hopefully.
So just to give a little bit of context to this site, we're looking at the 3 units, a Tesco, a Superdrug, and what looks to be kind of a home refurbishment type outfit on the ground floor. Now, in this context, we accept that Tesco's need is still going to be there, and to an extent, Superdrug as well. Although for the purposes of our proposal, we're looking at kind of cutting back the retail space, potentially in tandem looking at the kind of need of that space. Fundamentally, it's a pharmacy, and they may not want to retail kind of the smaller bit that they do, so reducing their square footprint. And the kind of residential refurb unit we'll come back to and have a look at in a second. But to give some context to the site, this is a kind of high street location. We're talking off Whitton High Street, sort of suburban London. We've got access to the back through an access route here, and some low-level 2-story units along the back, which are residential. And just to kind of take it to a bit of context, you've kind of got this really grim frontage out the back, rubbish piling up. You've got these really nasty looking residential units that are a bit soulless.
Christina, sorry, Tina, could I just pause you there for a second? Could you press Control L to make your screen full size, please?
Ooh.
Just so the presentation comes out a little better. Is that right? Oh, yes, that's ideal. Thank you very much.
Perfect. So as I was just saying, you've got these residential units at the back that front onto the block. The advantage is that you're sort of 5 minutes walking distance from Whitton Station. So considering those things and looking at the block that we're looking at, and the fact that it's the high street, they retain the high street frontage. But again, looking at some of the constraints, we see Tesco staying at the ground floor, so the footprint has been retained. And on the upper levels, we're adding in 2 stories fundamentally for residential, and then staggering that to 3 stories so that we're set it back from the front high street, and then allowing for some roof terraces. And by chopping back the Superdrug unit, we allow for a small courtyard space. Again, I think a lot of what's come out of this kind of COVID situation is that people do value green space, create a nice outlook and approach, and that reduces some of that grim approach that we were getting originally from this kind of aspect. And just touching on this kind of 18-meter rule, that avoids overlooking on these 2-story units here. And again, we've set it back another 18 meters on this side. So we think critically we could probably get about 16 to 18 1- and 2-bedroom units by looking at this sort of configuration.
Do you have any more planning? That's planning. 18 meters, that's planning.
Yeah, well, yeah. That is
Carry on.
From an architectural perspective, it's not a constraint I would want to ignore, because I know that overlooking is fundamentally an issue. So when we just look at even the viability of it, I think it's one that, we can ignore some policy sides of things, but the kind of criteria of the block isn't one that I like to kind of put aside. And this kind of unit that kind of may not need its current use, we kind of propose it to be almost like a work hub for the residents of the block. What we'll find is that as companies increasingly encourage their staff to work from home, not everybody's got the capacity, the space, and also just having a little bit of space where you can walk downstairs or go somewhere else to break out to have a bit of workspace is going to be something that's going to probably be welcomed by the workers fundamentally, and a little bit of interaction that isn't just your 4 walls of your home. And I think it's slightly different from the kind of WeWork model where you've got large spaces for co-working. This is kind of more sort of 6 to 10 desks and very localized, and keeping it quite natural. And touching on the fact that, we've got Tesco's and Superdrug, which may well stay. If they were slightly different uses, we potentially look at putting a nursery downstairs and some wellness sort of activity within the retail asset.
I think,
Sorry, go on.
No, go on.
Yeah, an alternative that we looked at, and this is sort of increasing densities to the block, is potentially kind of a U-shaped configuration, again, with the 18-meter parameters, and some landscape areas are there. And again, terracing on the roof level to allow for sort of more premium units, and potentially underneath this kind of cantilevered courtyard, we could have some waste refuse storage, bike storage, or you could take the units all the way down to ground as well there. Just to put that into context with some other examples, some live examples, this is a site that we're currently on site with in Essex, where we've done something very similar. This happens to be a conservation area and a listed building. And again, there we've got the access road at the back. And with this, we've just kind of landscaped courtyards. We've created some flats along the rear there. The retail unit on ground floor is retained, although we split that one into 2 smaller units. And just from a frontage aspect to make it attractive for residential use, and bearing in mind this is listed, we've kind of changed the outlook, taken away some of the grubby buildings that are around there at the back, and just stripped it back to give us that greenery and that frontage to make it a little bit more desirable. So that's kind of where we are with it.
Thank you, Tina. And I think just to kind of put a bit of a wrap up around that particular asset and how that one works, and I think there's a couple of really key features within this as an asset which makes it work. And Tina, if you go back to slide, I think it's slide 1 or 2, one of the very early ones when you're looking at the sort of the ground floor layout. And one of the key points you picked up here is the service yard at the back and the access yard at the back. And you know, from a redevelopment perspective, you can see along the high street some of the other units that stretch further along Whitton High Street here. They don't have that access yard. So they don't have quite the same set of qualities that this particular block offers. And I think further to that as well, the Superdrug piece, the Tesco piece, you know, Tina very, very rightly identified that those are 2 tenants that are likely to stay here. The food store market's very, very good still. That's, you know, that's a part of the retail space that's still very strongly performing and likely to maintain such. If in the event we assume Tesco's is not there and it is an alternative, perhaps more low-key, private trader in that unit, what a lot of people are talking about here is chopping those units in half and offering still a retail function at the front, whatever that might look like, albeit on a far reduced scale, but then with a last mile logistics function at the back where, you know, subject to the service requirements that the logistics operator will have, they can use that as just a store for all of this fun online retail warehousing bits and pieces. And the last mile logistics conversation is one that's very, very active at the moment. So I think, you know, when you're looking at these, when you're assessing these as development opportunities, there's a couple of really key signals that you need to be picking up on that create the development prospect. So just getting your hands on a string of 5 retail assets and thinking you've got, you know, upside of the 30 to 40 flats on top, or whatever it might look like, not always the case. So I think coming back around here, the architectural schematics, that piece is key to exploring whether or not there's an opportunity that exists in these. So I think that's all I had to say on that one. Do either Lita or Paul have anything just to add to that for the time being? That's the first time I think either of you have seen that. So it'd be interesting to put you on the spot and just see what comments you might have relating to that one.
It's very similar to some schemes that we've done recently in London. The key is getting your separate entrance for your Resi up to the upper levels, and still releasing whatever you've got on the ground floor, and seeing where the opportunities are. The one that we've done just recently, we looked to try and just push the height of the building to gain an extra story and maximise the development value. But otherwise, great scheme.
Yeah.
I would say the same thing as well. We had a similar project where we were converting offices, which actually I think were originally some residential, and again listed as well. So, but we were looking to maximize by potentially putting some more units above, and we were lucky. We didn't have an issue. We did have one access, although our issue there was the existing access wasn't really going to work in terms of the new fire regulations. So we had to try and find an alternative access. So, and the other things which we had issues with were bin storage, and, you know, but again, our one was a PD. So because of that issue, we were able to mitigate some of those sort of more awkward requirements. But I think for me, it's all about weighing up the bigger picture of what we're trying to achieve, versus the small, you know, rather than trying to trip up a proposal on maybe one small planning policy that, you know, the whole scheme doesn't adhere to. So what Tina was saying was interesting about the, you know, obviously overlooking. There are certain ones which we have to be mindful of, no matter, you know, what we're doing.
That's right. And I think within the confines of the known architectural constraints, known planning constraints for residential, you know, sort of Tina's mapped those in there, so that will make sense. It's the, you know, it's the overarching policy protecting employment space, protecting, you know, that retail function, which is one that for this forum, this discussion, we believe is one up for, you know, up for grabs, as it were. I think I'd like to move on if we can. We are on a time bomb. So thank you very much indeed, Tina, for your efforts on that one. Interesting to see how actually that one does get delivered if it does so. So we play on to track. Paul, Debenhams, Guildford. This is obviously an asset that we've talked about already. Alex Bright correctly identified it's been in the market recently. Asking price £20 million. I tried to act actually for a buyer on this one. The numbers went ridiculous. Rightly said, it is indeed under offer for mid-20s. Again, a bit of agent speak here and there and everywhere, but that is, you know, we're talking about 20% over guide price on an asset that, God, it's not the easiest to develop. So, really interesting one to pick up as a case study, because it certainly will be redeveloped at some point with Debenhams coming out in Jan 21. So really interesting piece here. Paul, over to you.
Thank you very much. I think, as you probably just saw, as I just walked down the road there, Debenhams is certainly a quite a lump of a building. There's no real kind of link through from the road to the river, and that's part of the problem in Guildford, is that the River Way is very much hidden away amongst all the buildings. So I'll just move on to what I have done. I started off just by taking some images onto the iPad and just sketching over, and you can see here on the Google image. Pardon?
Control L, just make it full screen. Yep. Hopefully it doesn't crash.
I just zoomed in. Hopefully that'll do it better.
Yeah, fine. Thank you. Yeah, perfect.
Okay, so you can see how big the block is, and you have this debate whether you try to refurb it or whether you demolish it. And I think if you try to refurbish the whole floor plate, once you've started, you've kind of got to finish, and there's no way out. You're kind of locked in. So I took the view that the block needed breaking down and looked at a demolition option. So in terms of Guildford, we've got the high street above. We've got the river at the bottom and views out to the landscape to the right. The topography is, this is basically at the bottom of a hill. A hill goes up to the top of the page, up to where Guildford Castle is, up to the sort of right-hand side at the top. So then I've taken that, and then you see, as you go through sketching, you kind of see how the scale of the Debenhams unit is that much bigger than anything else that surrounds it.
A very big lump, that.
It is a very big lump, yeah. There is only one bridge here and a little pedestrian bridge here. The A281, which is a busy road, comes through above the site. But the river comes below, and there's a really nice river walk that goes all the way out of town towards Godalming at the bottom. But there's no, firm link across. There's only the bridge here and a little pedestrian link here. So, that just gives you a feel for the lump that this building is. It's something like, just counting bricks on Google, it's something like 15 meters tall.
I think it is 12 commercial stories, I believe.
Oh, right, okay. So that's about right. So I started kind of looking at it, and you say, well, okay, you've got a public space on the left, and you've got a public space at the top where various different routes come down. And, it'd be very easy to look at the block like this and say, well, okay, I've got the noise from the road coming here, so maybe we'll put a block along there. Maybe that can be Resi, but it might be, need I say, offices maybe, albeit we're looking at Resi. And then there's the opportunity to really reactivate the riverfront along here, because there's just nothing there at the moment. So maybe that's where your river goes, your Resi goes. However, that gives you this big courtyard in the middle, and I don't think it really does much more than the block does before, because you've still got this boundary. So I looked at it in a different view. I said, okay, let's turn everything sort of 390 degrees and do strips of blocks that you can then activate routes through. These can be the sort of the active high street, if you like, with whatever use on the ground floor, whether it's retail, whether it's community use, whether it's live work, with residential above that. And I felt in a sort of a COVID world, then it gave you the opportunity to have a relatively kind of shadow plan block with good daylighting, good cross ventilation and whatnot. So I kind of went from that, and then I also thought about how are you going to service this? Maybe you need some kind of podium that you can come in on a portion of it, so that you can bring service vehicles in with car parking as well. And then took it another stage further. It's like great having routes all the way through to the river, and opening up the views from Guildford all the way through to the river. But what about having something that comes through in the other direction? So I went from the iPad and I went to good old fashioned tracing paper, and just started doing some hand sketches. So again, here, this just gives you a bit of a better idea. The bridge is here. There's a little pedestrian bridge here. So these would be the blocks. Maybe they're at different, they're terraced at different heights, and there's maybe a green roof for some of the amenity and public space, in effect forming other high streets through the middle of these blocks where all the activity is, and then providing another public space right on the corner where all the views are out into the river and out to the landscape beyond. The other interesting thing was adding some extra bridges to improve that kind of circulation between each side of the river. So this, you're not treating the site as just this boundary, you're kind of looking at it in the round, in a bigger context, taking in the river walk on the other side of the river.
Yeah.
So I sort of went from there, and then thought, okay, well, let's have a little bit of a play. So I had a little bit of a play in SketchUp.
This isn't dissimilar to the way the St George's scheme in Wandsworth. Do you know the one I mean?
No, I don't. No, I don't.
Berkeley St George. It's not dissimilar to the way that one actually looks, where they've kind of got finger-led design leading towards the river. It looks very, very similar.
Yeah, it's all about leading routes through to that river, because, as I said, the Guildford is just, the river's very much shut off from the rest of the town. So if there's a way of providing a view through, or there's circulation space, or whatever it might be, there's a real opportunity for that to be great public space right alongside the river, and there's nowhere else in Guildford that would be like that. So it'd be pretty a great addition. So you can see here, I sort of started massing things around. How high do they need to be? I think I've drawn this at around 18 meters, but then I looked at doubling it here, and what does that end up being? The great benefit is that the land slopes. There's a hill that slopes up behind on the 281 side, so you could almost hide the extra height in that sort of space, if you like, but still maintain a view through to the river. So I've gone with high alongside the road, going down to low alongside the river, and again you've got the noise of the 281, so that might be a good way of kind of screening it. So I've gone from the simple massing blocks to, can you terrace it? Can you have amenity space on the roof? And then I looked at, can you then kind of split that through? And then I've got a close-up of that. And actually a podium would work quite well, because you could take a podium over a portion of that with steps down to the river, and you could use that space as your service space and car parking. So this becomes a much more vibrant place to be. It links into the other side of the river. There's a pub there. This whole area becomes much more active, rather than just something that is shut off from the river and from the rest of Guildford, which is up onto the top side of this image, as you see it. And that's as far as we went really. We've sort of thought a little bit about plan depth and how that might work with where your stairs might go, and corridors and all that kind of stuff, because there's a whole load of things about fire strategy and stair access and all that kind of stuff that you would need to consider as well. But that's where we got to.
Yeah, and I think, again, just sort of wrapping up on that one, and thank you very much, Paul. That's a really interesting way of delivering that site, or looking at a way of delivering that site. And again, it'd be really interesting to see how this one does evolve over time. And I think kind of the key takeaways here are that, you know, you've got a big lump, big volume of real estate, a big mass there to try and do something with on a redevelopment play. And, you know, obviously the retail world doesn't need an awful lot of fenestration. You know, it doesn't need that. It doesn't need the light permeating through the building to create that. See, the residential play does. So thinking about the existing building fabric, can you reutilize that in some way, shape or form? And obviously the conclusion here is that you can't, unless you've put some quite substantial interventions into that building, which from our perspective don't appear to be entirely feasible when it comes to the numbers. So we talked before about the numbers versus the reality, and I think this is one of those scenarios where you've got an awful lot of floor space, you've got an awful lot of mass, you've got an awful lot of real estate, which has an intrinsic value. Clearly the alternative use value here, probably for residential, given the Guildford market and the location of the site, albeit I can easily see mixed use being the way that this one comes up. So I think that's a really interesting and a really good solution for that site, and it feels right. It feels of a sensible scale, a sensible map, a sensible everything.
The other thing that we thought, sorry to jump in, the other thing we talked about was phasing, Alex, wasn't it? That you could phase this. You've got an exit strategy. If something went wrong, you could stop at a point and carry on. Whereas with the big lump of Debenhams, once you've started, you've kind of got to finish it, and you're kind of locked in terms of cash.
And that very principle actually segues really neatly into Lita's piece, because the larger land holdings here, where you've got many acres to deal with, where, you know, your unit numbers, your development quantum is going to be quite substantial. And, you know, one of the critical things here when you're developing a business plan around how to redevelop, what to do with these assets, is, you know, and the thing that we're saying an awful lot at the moment to our clients is, you need a flexible strategy. We are right now in a world where we don't quite know what is going to happen, and that is paramount. So when you're delivering, when you're thinking about planning these schemes, flexibility is key. Flexible planning consent, flexible land uses, flexible phasing and delivery is all key. And with that in mind, we're going to move on to Lita now, who's going to talk to us through Surrey Quays, which very coincidentally, not known, not planned, it received a planning consent on the 29th of May 2020.
Yes, which we didn't realise that until last night.
No, talk about it. So the planning permission for this site has just been given. So please don't go and Google that, because probably this is all going to be very different. But what Lita's done here is without any regard to that planning permission whatsoever. So this is clean slate thinking. And with no further ado, Lita, over to you.
Okay, perfect.
Juliana,
yeah, for some reason I can't, my share screen is not working. So thank you, Juliana, for helping out. Okay, so I'm going to, let me just run through my slides as well. Yes. So the slide that Juliana has there, yeah. So this is the site that I was asked to look at, and you can see that there is a red and a blue area. The red, for those who don't know, is the Surrey Quays Shopping Centre, and the blue area is and has an Odeon and a bowling alley in two large sheds, and the rest of it is effectively car park with a few smaller buildings, small restaurant type buildings in it. And when we look at, I mean, we do a lot of master planning in the office. So when we get a project like this, we always think, well, how can we actually we don't feel we can design something in a footprint like this, so we have to start to look at the wider context. So slide 3, Juliana. Next slide, sorry. Yeah. And so we start to look at where, just a sec, sorry. If you go back, Juliana. Yeah, perfect, thank you. I think I might have a delay on my seeing your screen, Juliana, so apologies. So we're on slide 3, and we're looking at the site within the wider context to really understand what, where are the local centres, where are the primary centres, Where are all the key routes? Are there any opportunity areas? For example, we can see immediately that there's quite a lot of wasteland, car parking spaces, which are not really used for anything other than, well, obviously the cars, and don't really lend themselves to placemaking or to any sort of value adding. So I think it's a really important to get this understanding of the wider context. And also we can see as well that we have in our site a big shopping center, which doesn't really, it's single use, it's not permeable, and it doesn't, again, offer itself to any form of placemaking. So the other thing we can think about here is in terms of landowners. Now, we own the land, or the client would own the land in the red areas, the site, but there may be opportunities to make connections with other landowners within the vicinity to think in a more joined up way for how you might design this place. Because for me, I don't think it's possible to design just in the sites. You really have to look at designing a bigger master plan for the wider area, which in fact was what was put into the planning, interestingly enough.
Land. Yeah.
So with that in mind, going to the next slide, which is slide 4, Alex has been talking about the fact that obviously planning has its limitations in a certain way. It can be helpful for projects which are as we know them, but for some projects where there might be, you know, you're working in a sort of unknown or a new area, planning can actually hinder development and you know, moving forward. So I think sometimes we have to think, you know, rather than be hindered, we don't want a computer says no type approach. So if there's one policy that, you know, a proposal doesn't adhere to, then the whole project is shot. Or if we can't find a landowner, then, you know, the whole project doesn't move forward. We have to think of a different process to then drive planning through. So we use a process called inquiry by design, which is a collaborative design process where we invite all key stakeholders of a project and interested parties into usually a series of workshops and meetings to thrash out vision and usually a master plan for an area and thereafter we have smaller workshops for, like, say, the transport, for environment, you know, landscaping, etc. But usually the first, you know, we have like a week-long workshop to get the vision in place. And this really helps with getting over the obstacles that, you know, planning at the present time may restrict. And you can see it's a very, the idea is to try and get buy-in from all these people. And that includes, for example, the planning officers, people, you know, local politicians and so on. Because if you get them on board, then actually you can make changes quite quickly to planning policy, because planning policy is not actually set in stone. And there are emergency powers that can be used to change planning policy quite quickly if that's what the consensus of a workshop like this is. So it's a really helpful tool for, you know, projects of this nature. And even, for example, for the project that Tina talked about, even a smaller one, it still can be very helpful to get over issues when there's a bigger picture and a bigger vision in mind. So if we go to slide 5, so we looked at 2 different options. There's an option where we retained the existing retail units on the east side, and then there's an option where we didn't retain them. And the reason for that is viability, because at this stage, we, you know, in the space of a couple of days, we didn't have much time to look at viability, whether, you know, look at the numbers in the area. Is this going to be a place where it makes sense to knock down these retail units, or does it make more sense to keep them at the moment, and maybe at a future day those come down and some other uses come into place, you know, something like mixed use residential or even just residential. So we had a couple of block plans just to show you for the purpose of this seminar, where once we did our analysis of the wider context, we quickly saw that there's opportunities to link in with the existing primary centre, which is at the Canada Water Station area. And there's actually a very nice link along the water, which we thought could be strengthened and linked to a new secondary public open space, which would be in front of the shopping centre. And then, as you can see, we've master planned the areas on our site in the yellow, and then master plan the areas around, which we feel could help to strengthen this bigger picture in orange, because it's very important. Alex was talking about viability.
Sorry.
Everything that we do in terms of design, we think of viability as well. For us, design has to go hand in hand with viability. Otherwise, it's just a nice idea that never happens. Right, yeah. So, yes, we'll take a little bit more time to do the master planning on the other sites, but it will help to strengthen the viability on ours. So, yes, and what I want to also talk about here is the scale of the existing retail units on the east. So if we go to the next slide, I'm just conscious of time, so otherwise I'll talk forever. So if we go to the next slide, which shows the Odeon, the Odeon building.
That's up a couple of slides, sorry, that's up a few more slides, back a few slides, I believe. Yeah.
Yes, that's it, yeah. So for example, if we were to keep, if the viability study says, well, actually we have to keep these buildings because they're not viable to take out at the moment, in the first phase, then we have to think about how can we, for example, make that building a little less, bulky and more human scale. And this is below the Odeon photograph is an image of a block plan, just like a massing model that we had done for a block of flats, which actually was new. But the planners said to us that they wanted something at the ground and upper first floor to be more in tune with the scale of, say, a terraced houses. So say the proportions, the rhythm, and so on. So perhaps it might be something that can be done in the Odeon facade in the same manner. I think that slide shows that you can actually, whether it's a change of simply color, maybe you add some different facade onto the front, maybe you add some piercing so you have a more mass to void ratio, which creates rhythm. I think there's opportunity to do sort of something which doesn't cost very much, but which could make a big difference to the public realm. And if we go to the slide after that, you'll see there our second, so Juliana, the next slide, please. Thank you. So you see the next master plan, or indicative block plan rather, which shows those units taken out. And what you have here is just another set of blocks which links to the overall block plan, and a series of open green spaces. And that's assuming that would work in terms of the viability. Now, if we quickly look on to the western part where we had the shopping center building, what we've suggested here, either you can take them out completely, like, for example, the Debenhams building, and then you just master plan it with a mixed use set of blocks, if that's what the viability allows, or if it's considered that this is such a big building and it's going to take so much to demolish and et cetera, then maybe we look at ways that we can deal with what we have in a way, again, that enhances placemaking, the ground level, public spaces, and so on. So what we've done here is introduced key routes through the building, because that in itself is almost like the scale of 3 blocks of walkable blocks, and that will help to break down the scale immediately. And those routes could be either internal, or you could actually physically cut the building if it's allowed in terms of viability, in order to get those routes through. Now you'll see that there are some darker yellow lines along the perimeter of that building. And if we go to the next slide, Juliana, yes, that one, thanks. They're actually, although, most people think of this building as quite an ugly building, and a lot of it is, and, a lot of it you would want to get rid of. But I think we can see here that if we look closely, there are a few bits to this building which you probably could change, you could retrofit into something like live work units. So you have workshops or workspaces on the ground level, and then some accommodation, like residential accommodation above, and they could be quite nice with, those big windows into a living, dining, kitchen space, for example. And obviously that's, again, viability permitting. And you can see in the top left-hand corner, the plan of the building and where these brick structures are. So, and again, Alex and I were talking that they might have actually been there already and were integrated into this. I'm not sure, but I think anyway, architecturally, I think they're of some merit and should be explored with a view to retrofitting. and then starting to activate a public space in front of that. So next slide is, yeah, now that I just showed quickly because it's the walk between the Canada Wharf Centre and our proposed centre. And you can see it's a very nice, you know, asset, having the river there, that walk, and I think we should capitalise on it.
Can I start asking you to round up a little bit? We are just out over time.
Okay. Okay, if Juliana, next slide, please. So moving on, I think there's a huge opportunity. So we've looked at the block plans, the 2 block plans so far, and on the left-hand side are some examples of what you might do in terms of planning that out. So in terms of, for example, creating some form of perimeter block or blocks where you have higher corners so you can get more dual aspect flats. And so these are a couple of our projects, well, one of our projects on the left-hand side. The ones on the right are some images which I think are already in existence or are about to be built in Stratford. And it gives a feel for the public realm. And, you know, it's, again, modern building, something which a developer would financially find feasible. But, you know, you're creating quite nice environments on that ground level with a mix of uses, you know, in terms of a little bit of cafe, retail, and the resi above. Next slide, Juliana. And again, a couple of our projects above, one in Richmond, one in Newark, where you know, you're looking at the perimeter block, high density on, in particular, you can go up to, I would say, maybe 5 stories comfortably in here, in this area. And you can see below that sort of, again, environment, which is well landscaped and is inviting for people to use. And as we're running out of time, we'll just be quick. Next slide, Juliana, please. Thank you. And again, there's even opportunities, I would say, to do some kind of, you know, object building or, you know, some kind of marking of a certain area with like tower elements and so on. So again, a couple of projects that we are working on just now in the office. But this area of London lends itself to this high density living, but really good quality public realm environment. And I'll leave you with the final slide, just the 2 options that we looked at there, the 2 indicative block plans.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. And I know Alex is probably about to kick us all out and tell us to do something different, but I just wanted to do one final little wrap up, and I promise it'll be under 2 minutes. So I think one of the key things here, and that final slide there shows it perfectly. When I, as an agent, am advising a landowner of what to do here, and a lot of landowners of this nature are funds, they're corporate clients of Cushman's and others. And the key thing here is demonstrating flexibility and strategy, which we mentioned on the one beforehand. But where there is a substitution process, and what Lita's shown here is on one side, a retention of the retail that exists because either it's viable to do so, but you've got an awful lot of parking land around it, so you can create and develop around the existing assets, or indeed you replace them altogether. And I think as a kind of final takeaway, the asset rebalancing, the valuation of these assets is not rebalanced yet. You know, the valuers, certainly the Cushman and Wakefield valuers and others around that will value these assets, they've not yet removed their COVID-19 caveat clauses of these valuations. And they will not be doing so until there is any reasonable evidence out there to suggest they should. Reasonable evidence in a valuer's mind is legitimate rent changes, chips, adjustments, whatever they might be, whether it's the value, the term, whatever. That will impact on the investment value, which will impact on the decision to develop or to hold or to do nothing. And I think as a final little corporate plug, Cushman and Wakefield think we're pretty good in this space. We're building a development change of use model. So that is a sort of 113 data points baked into a financial model. And what that's there to do is to predict temporally when, what, and how these assets will be redeveloped. So sort of a sliding scale of number of resi units, how much mixed use space, when the lease terms might be or may not be coming into adjustment, and therefore when the alternative use value stretches that above the existing use value. So on that fine note, I think I'll pass it back over to Alex. But thank you very much indeed, Lita, Tina, and Paul for all of that hard work in there. And I hope the audience has found something of use here.
Yeah, to echo Alex's comment there as well. It's incredible to see these cases come to life on screen. It's the first time we've done this kind of concept for a virtual conference. And for me, who's very visually focused, it's nice to kind of follow a journey and go through that process with the architects, which I really, really enjoyed. It's so difficult sometimes as a developer, and when I previously was a developer, to look at a summary sheet come through and start to visualize, well, where is this going to go? But it's great to go through that process with the architects and cover it off, and expertly led, Alex. So thank you very much. We haven't got a lot of time for questions, unfortunately. Obviously, now is sort of the formal close of the session, but we can stay open for up to an hour if you want to approach any of the architects we've got here. I've also put all of their links, if you want to get in touch with them or learn more about them, to their TrustedLand profiles in the chat. So you can click on those and learn a bit more about the kind of projects they're involved in. And in just a few weeks' time, you'll be able to see a full list of their track records as well. That comes with the new TrustedLand matching tool as well. So do check that out in a few weeks' time. We'll make sure we let you know about it. Just a note to say, obviously, the 8th of July is the next event. We'd love to have you there, 2 till 4 p.m. Oak North will be helping to lead a conversation around the financing of projects in the post-COVID world. And we'll have Salvas talk a little bit about their market research post-Q2 rent period as well. Just one quick question before we go, just for the panelists. One of the things that I used to live in a large house builder development as a renter, and one of the things I always got frustrated is looking at the communal area where they provided a few benches and picnic benches in this kind of goldfish environment. Nobody ever used it. And I always decided that if I was going to build out development that sort of size, that I would make it something that gave people a bit of the opportunity to have private events, even if it was just sort of slightly shielded, or the idea that they could go into their little quarter or their little third or whatever it was of that space and use it to have a barbecue or a picnic or a play session with the kids, whatever it was. Do you think in the post-COVID world, where people are becoming more careful of their personal space and obviously been through this sort of quite horrific experience, that we'll start seeing more of those kind of designed into schemes and open space?
I'll field that from an agent's perspective before the architects jump in. I absolutely think there needs to be a fundamental shift in the way that our apartments have been delivered and densities are used by house builders. I think we'll see a bigger shift in the way that land uses work. If you look at some of the sort of land use models and land use economy models that the very clever people from even the 1860s and 1870s came up with, Ebenezer, his model of economic land use. I think that's all up for grabs now. I think that's all up for change. The idea of a rent model where density is driven by rents or rents are driven by density, whichever way you want to look at it. I think that's all up in the air. So I'm not convinced apartment living is going to be the way it was yesterday. I'm not convinced that any of the amenity space that's afforded by apartment living is necessarily appropriate, certainly on many of them. I think a lot of developers are going to be going back in for planning to change some of their schemes at the moment that they are nervous about putting a spade in the ground on because they are not sure they've got a seller's market. I think an awful lot of those are going to go back into planning, units lost, amenity space driven, just to sell the assets. Agent's view.
Wonderful. Architects, starting to do this already?
Well, I think interesting that you mention Ebenezer Howard, and I think if we look at traditional forms of urban design and city building, we'll find that there was, amenity space was built in quite sensibly in a way that it wasn't in that sort of windswept fish or ducks in a pond sort of way that you were mentioning there, Alex. And I think we have to start looking back for clues to go forward. Because a lot of our problems started in the post-war era, with modernism coming into play, and really not thinking about the human body, the human condition, and what we really need. It was based, obviously, as many people know, on a theory which was well intended for the time, but didn't really serve as resulted with many of the estates that we have today and which have been knocked down. So I think it's really going back to the great London squares that we have, the areas for food growing, the allotments, places to, even the way we design streets so that you can actually sit comfortably on a bench or bump into someone and have a chat for half an hour, 20 minutes. Those sort of niches have to be thought about a lot more carefully going forward.
There's a really good example, Kings Hill in Kent. There's a really good example of a very, very, very well-developed almost ecosystem where it's a live, work, play. There's a PJ rated golf course. There's 1 million square feet of offices and 3,000 homes all on one campus. Great example of placemaking.
What's that called, Alex? Sorry?
Kings Hill in Kent. The RICS delivered an information paper in 2018, which I wrote a part of, on placemaking and value. Okay. Kings Hill was one of the best examples we come up with on placemaking and value. It's good.
Okay, very interesting. Wonderful. Well, listen, we'll take the opportunity to thank our panel again, and to Alex for putting the hard work. I can promise you there has been a lot of sessions behind the scenes to get to this point to make sure the content is as great as it was, and I hope everyone took a lot of value from that as well. We have got the various tables that are marked up here with different topics, so if you want to hang around for sort of 10-15 minutes and catch up with a quick conversation on with some experienced peers, jump onto those tables, see if there's any topics that you want to jump into. Otherwise, free to have a little roam around, and we'll see you back for the 8th of July with Oak North and Savills. Thank you very much, everyone. Really appreciate it. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes.